This lecture serves as an introduction to the science of human anatomy and physiology. There's a lot of various topics to cover throughout this chapter, so we will bounce around quite a bit from topic to topic, but that's because this is a very broad overview. So the term anatomy literally is the study of structure, and it means to cut up or to cut open. And so, really, what we're talking about and what this course is going to ultimately focus on is the relationship among parts of the body along with the structure of individual organs. So, we're looking basically at the parts, the structures of the body that actually allow these organs, organ systems, and ultimately the organism, the human, to actually function and survive. Now, to look at anatomy, you can actually come at anatomy from really any level of magnification or a level of detail. And so it ranges anywhere from microscopic, so this would be cytology or the study of individual cells, or histology to the study of tissues, those aggregations or collections of cells that give rise to new function. That is what a tissue is. And this goes all the way up to what we call gross anatomy, which has a lot of different perspectives. It could be developmental anatomy. So that is, what is the anatomy of, say, the developing individual across lifespan? What is the anatomy of, say, an embryo, right? And looking at a fetus as it develops. What is the anatomy of death? So pathology or disease. What is the surface level anatomy, right? And we can look at things from either a systemic point of view, so that is the whole body overall, or a regional perspective, so that is a very specific portion of the body. Let's say gastrointestinal, for example, focuses on a specific region of the body. Now, this is much more of a kind of a resounding theme within biology, and this is the idea of organization, right? So we see that as we increase in organization, so that is, once we take a cell and we put a bunch of cells together into a tissue, we see a change in the actual functions, the abilities of that organizational unit. So that is to say here, okay, so let's start from the very beginning. So atoms, molecules, these things are not alive, right? But they are the basis for what builds cells. They're what builds cells ultimately. So if you put atoms and molecules together in a certain combination, you end up with a cell. Now, a cell is the basic unit of life. This is the smallest unit of life that also demonstrates the characteristics of life. And cells are capable of doing certain things, very specific things. But if you put a bunch of different cells together into one specific organization, all of a sudden that tissue has all kinds of functions that any of the individual cells by themselves could not do. So that is, the tissue has new characteristics, new properties that the cells by themselves could not achieve. Now, if you put tissues together into an organ, let's say the small intestine is a good example here, all of a sudden this organ, the small intestine in this case, can do far more than the epithelium could, or the individual connective tissues could, that help make up this small intestine. So this organ now has far greater functions than we're seen in the organization level below it. But the small intestine is not the only organ within, say, the digestive system. So it is just an integral piece of a bigger organ system. And that's where the organ system comes in. You take all the digestive organs ultimately together, and all of a sudden you've got this collection of organs that can all of a sudden ingest and completely digest and compact and excrete waste, right? Solid waste in this case, from whatever we ingest. So it can We can actually ingest food, break it down into those molecules that we find useful, and expel the rest that we do not need. Right? Obviously, no single one of the organs within that organ system can do that alone. And then finally, we have the organism, right? So the overall living human being who, with all the organ systems working together, help maintain life as we know it. Now, there are four main human tissue types, four basic human tissue types. They are epithelial tissues, muscular tissues, nervous tissues, and finally, connective tissues. Now, we'll talk more about the tissues when we get into the histology, when we get into the histology chapter. But for the time being, let's rest on that. We're going to do a brief overview of each organ system. The integumentary system is the skin. So we're talking about the skin that surrounds the body, right? And this provides basic primary level protection for the body. It helps to regulate body temperature. So this is our body's first line of defense against organisms trying to get in per se and harm us, for example. It also provides protection from inclement weather and from the environment. It helps us to regulate body temperature and also at the same time allows us to prevent water loss as well to a great extent. So again, very useful system, has very specific functions. The skeletal system provides support and protection overall for the body. Now, remember, this is a internal support and protection. And that level of protection depends entirely on what we're talking about. So if we're talking about organs of, say, the thoracic cavity, there's a cage around that, but not an impenetrable cage, so to speak, but it's still a relatively decent cage that protects the heart and the lungs. Around the brain, however, we've got a very strong bony skull that goes around the brain that even protects the brain far more than we would see in the thoracic cavity. Oh, one more thing I forgot to point out here. The frame that the skeletal system provides internally is that same internal frame that actually allows for body movement. Muscles by themselves, as we're going to talk about here, must connect and pull on that internal frame. So without the skeletal system, the muscular system would not be able to do a great extent of its actual function. The muscular system, as I've talked about here, already kind of introduced you to, provides body movement. Most of the external movement that we're used to thinking about and seeing. But other than that, there's actually a couple of different functions that we often don't associate with the muscular system, and that is that it generates heat when the muscles contract. So we can actually heat our body to a point with this muscle contraction. Additionally, it acts as a sort of a second heart for the circulatory system that allows us to pump blood back to the heart for recirculation of that blood. The nervous system is what I like to think of as the instantaneous communication system of the body. And so that's really important to keep in mind. Instantaneous, right at this moment, contact system. It provides regulation over the entire body, right? Specifically over things like body movement, for example, if we're going to focus on specific things. But it is the regulatory system for the entire body. It responds to sensory stimuli, so that is, it's responsible for bringing in information to the body and then allowing the body to respond to those sensory stimuli with specific motor functions, specifically glands or muscular activity. And it controls all body systems. But again, we want to keep in mind this is instantaneous control. The endocrine system is much more long-term control. So we're talking about controlling activities of the body, but we're talking about controlling these activities long-term. So not short and instantaneous like the nervous system, but rather long term. And this consists of a complex arrangement of glands and cell clusters throughout the body. And so, a prime example of a difference between the nervous system and the endocrine system is that the nervous system can tell the body how to move in a specific set of ways in order to, say, walk down the street. That is a pretty instantaneous set of commands. But the endocrine system isn't going to do that. The endocrine system is more likely to tell your body develop secondary sex characteristics throughout puberty. So it's constantly going to be bathing the body in those hormones that are going to be then developing in these or targeting those organ systems and those portions of the body that are then going to in turn be developing these secondary sex characteristics. It takes a long time for those characteristics to fully develop, and so we're talking about a long-term activity here. The cardiovascular system, it consists of the heart and blood vessels. So we're talking about how we distribute things throughout the body, distribute cells, hormones, nutrients, gases, and wastes as well. How we distribute them throughout the body, how we remove those wastes from the cells and ultimately get them out of the body is also an activity, is also a function of the cardiovascular system. The lymphatic system is a lot like our water reclamation system. So think of like a city's sewer system to a point. The lymphatic system is a lot like that. This is going to reclaim the water that's lost in our tissues over time. It's going to transport that, what we call lymph, and it's going to filter it as well, because we have to make sure that we filter that fluid before it's returned into regular blood circulation. And so in here, we're going to initiate an immune response when necessary. So when we found that there is a potential infection here, that we're going to deal with that properly from an immune perspective. The respiratory system is responsible for gas exchange between the blood and lungs. So this is that system that is focused entirely on the ability for us to bring atmospheric gas in, specifically to exchange oxygen into our blood and exchange carbon dioxide out of our blood into the lungs, and then obviously back out of the body. The digestive system is there to mechanically and chemically digest food materials. And once those food materials are digested, to absorb the nutrients that we can take from that food and store them, use them. But there's a lot of aspects of our food that we simply cannot digest. And so those waste products then must be essentially bundled up, packaged up, and removed from the body. And so the digestive system plays all of these roles. The urinary system is all about filtering blood. So we're going to filter the waste out of our blood. So that is that we can continue to survive and maintain homeostasis without building too much of these wastes up in the blood to dangerous levels. Now, where are these wastes coming from, you might ask? They're normal body metabolites. So when our cells go through the process of doing chemical reactions to make certain things happen, there are chemicals that are produced by those reactions. We call them metabolites. And metabolites, when they build up at a certain concentration, can be dangerous and toxic. And so we must remove them from the blood and essentially remove them from the body. The reproductive systems, we're going to focus on the male first, but the reproductive systems are largely the same. They're to produce gametes, we call sex cells. In the male, it's meant to produce sperm cells. And it's also meant to produce hormones that are specific to that reproductive system. So again, in the male, we're talking about testosterone here. Females are going to produce gametes, specifically egg cells. And the reproductive system is also going to produce hormones specific to the female reproductive system, namely progesterone and estrogen. All right, switching topics now from a quick survey of all the organ systems, we're now going to focus on anatomical terminology. And this is a big part of this chapter. I would say, arguably, the biggest and most important aspect of this chapter, and the most important knowledge that you're going to get from this chapter. It allows us the ability to describe accurately where something is occurring on the body, or where, say, a wound is located on the body, so that the next person, somebody coming in well after your shift, as whatever healthcare professional you're serving as, can ultimately find that wound, or find that pain, or find that reference point that the patient is complaining about or concerned about. Now, first, we want to point out anatomical position. Nobody stands like this when they come into an emergency room, but we must refer to everything in some starting position. And so, ultimately speaking, this is considered to be the anatomical position. Now, remove for a moment the planes passing through this person's body and focusing on the fact that she's standing upright. Her toes are facing forward. Her face is, again, her head is facing forward, and her arms are splayed out at her side, but her palms are facing forward. This is anatomical terminology. And every term that we use references this particular position. Now, there are planes that pass through the body that we must understand. This plane here, this large square plane here, that imaginarily passes through this woman's body and ultimately bisects the body into front as well as back halves that you cannot see here. These are called either coronal or frontal planes. Now, these terms are synonymous, which means you may use either one. So that is a coronal plane or a frontal plane. Now, a transverse plane is going to pass through the body and ultimately separate it into a top and a bottom half. And recognize that just as the coronal or frontal, this section also does not produce what we call mirror halves of one another. That is, that the halves are not symmetrical. So the front half of your body should not look like the back half of your body. That, for a number of wonderful reasons, is in fact the case. And same thing with a transverse section. Any transverse section taken on your body is going to produce two sections that ultimately are not symmetrical. The top half is not going to be symmetrical to the bottom half. Again, characteristic. However, a sagittal, specifically a mid-sagittal section, has the ability to produce a symmetrical set of halves. A sagittal section will cut the body and produce left and right halves of the body. Now, if that left and right half ultimately ends up in two unsymmetrical halves, let's say the section goes right here and it passes through the left shoulder of this person and through the left chest wall and then down the left leg of this individual, this half here is not going to be symmetrical to the rest of her body. And therefore, this is not a mid-sagittal section. However, the mid-sagittal section, this section right here, passes directly through the midline of the body, and thus the two halves we get are symmetrical. And this is now termed a mid-sagittal section because we've got a left half of the body that is roughly symmetrical to the right half of the body. Now, understand that obviously there are unique nuances to each side of our body that are going to make them ultimately not symmetrical. That is, not perfectly symmetrical, but nonetheless they are in practice symmetrical. This slide basically explains in the first two lines everything I just discussed. However, this point here is not one I've talked about yet, so I want to make it a point of going through this. Any plane that passes through the body at a unique angle, that is at an angle that is not vertical or horizontal, so some angle in between those two, is called an oblique plane. Now, directional terms of the body are equally important here. We must be able to describe where something is located on the body relative to another. And so anterior is closer to the front portion of a person's body, and posterior is closer to the back of a person's body. Now, anterior and ventral are synonymous, which means technically, let's use a relative term here. The nose is anterior relative to the ears. Does that make sense? So somebody's nose should definitely be more anterior than the ear is. You can also say the nose is ventral relative to the ear. I won't use the term ventral and dorsal, however. So ventral equates to anterior and dorsal equates to posterior. I don't use ventral and dorsal. These are more common for, say, veterinarians or somebody that's working with an organism that's on all four legs. Humans, however, we tend to use the terms anterior and posterior, and so I will do the same. Make sure you practice these a lot, as for every other directional term we're going to go through. Now, superior is more near the head, and inferior is more towards the feet. In terms of other ways this might be referred to, cranial, again, is more towards the head, and caudal is more towards the feet. However, cranial and caudal, again, are terms that are specifically used for, again, more commonly used for four-legged animals. And so you'll see me refer specifically to superior versus inferior. So in this case, this individual's eyes are superior relative to his chin. Right? There's a good use of that. Or you could flip it the other way around. This person's chin is inferior to his eyes. Now, these terms, superior and inferior, really only work from the head all the way down to the pelvis. They do not work from the arms or the legs, and there's an important reason why. Now, we're going to assume for a moment that your patient does not come in perfectly in anatomical position, which I can imagine is very true of nearly all patients coming into the ER. So it makes sense here at the moment where something is related to something else from a superior or inferior position. If the hand is only, or if the arm is only like this. But what happens if this individual's arm is up? So that is, his palm is all the way up here. Would that not now change the position of one structure relative to another? It should, if you're using the terms superior and inferior. So these terms don't apply to the arms and legs. And instead, we want to look to these terms here, proximal and distal. Proximal means that a structure is closer to the trunk along that particular limb. So in this case, the shoulder is proximal relative to the elbow. And the term distal means that the structure is actually farther away from the trunk relative to, say, another structure. In this case, let's say the fingers, or phalanges, are distal relative to the elbow. That makes sense. So distal means distant or farther away from the trunk. Proximal means proximate or close to or closer to the trunk. Medial and lateral refer to how far something is from the midline of the body. So if two structures are closer to the midline, then they are considered to be medial relative to something else. And we'll use these examples again. The eyes, this individual's eyes, are medial relative to her ears. And in the same respect, you could use an exact different analogy here. This woman's shoulders are lateral relative to her eyes. Right? So something closer to the sides of the body are considered to be lateral. Deep and superficial are a bit more complicated. These deal with structures that are completely enclosed in another structure, so that is layers of things. The muscle of the body, the skeletal muscle of the body, is deep relative to the skin. Does that make sense? Nowhere in the body should you be able to find skeletal muscle that is actually superficial relative to the skin. So that is, it should not be more towards the outside of the body than the actual skin itself. And you can go the opposite direction too. The skin, the integument, is superficial relative to the skeletal muscle. Proximal and distal we already covered. This is just a slide focusing specifically on those. Anatomical landmarks are quick places on the body which are considered to be landmarks. Now, I will not expressly expect that you learn them because it's not something I'm going to test you on. However, they can be very useful, and they will come up again in other chapters moving forward. But this is a figure showing landmark areas, landmark regions of the body. So say, for example, the nasal region is that area associated with the nose. The orbital region is that area associated with the eye. The abdominal region is that area associated with the abdomen. The femoral area is that area associated with the thigh, right? So names for specific body regions. And posterior regions has this exact same they have different terms to focus on different regions, but again, the same kind of thing, landmarks. Body cavities, right? Now, there are body cavities we definitely need to know and understand. We definitely have to understand that there is a cranial cavity within the skull, and that cranial cavity is actually continuous with the vertebral canal that passes directly through the actual vertebral column. So we see that here. Now, within the actual ventral cavity, we see this broken up into a thoracic cavity and then the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is this region here. And notice they're demarcated by the diaphragm. Now, the thoracic cavity is located within the actual rib cage. And just inferior to the diaphragm, we have two cavities here. First, the abdominal cavity that goes from the actual pelvis all the way superiorly to the diaphragm. And then the pelvic cavity, which goes from the actual beginning of the pelvis all the way to the inferiormost portion of the pelvis. Collectively, these two cavities are called the abdominal pelvic cavity. Quadrants are very important to learn because often a patient will come in complaining of pain in a certain region of, say, their abdominal cavity overall, or they'll come in with an actual wound somewhere on their body. And so the abdominal pelvic quadrants breaks up the actual abdominal pelvic cavities into 4 quadrants. Now, the left upper quadrant is here in the left corner, so to speak, of the actual abdominal pelvic cavity. This is your patient's left. In this case, you do not matter. The person that matters is ultimately the patient. So we're referring to the patient's sides of their body, not yours. So left upper quadrant here, right upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, and left lower quadrant. I will not refer to these things by the abbreviations LLQ, RLQ, RUQ, or LUQ. That's probably a charting thing. I am not a medical doctor. I will refer to them by right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, left lower quadrant, left or right lower quadrant. So I'll refer to them in the full term. You should know the basic organs that are found in each of these quadrants. That is something that I will test you on. The abdominal pelvic regions narrows down this idea of locality along the abdominal pelvic cavity. And so this is really important. And again, here it's almost like a really weird twisted medical tic-tac-toe where you've got 3 columns and 3 rows. And you need to know each of these regions. Right hypochondriac and the left hypochondriac, respectively, are essentially the left and right corners of the abdominal pelvic cavity. And that central region here in between is called the epigastric. Think of this as kind of the middle of the digestive system and therefore epigastric. Moving towards the middle portion of the abdominal pelvic cavity, you've got the right and left lumbar regions. These are associated with the left and right sides of the body and lumbar vertebra. That portion in the middle should essentially be where the umbilical cord used to be when you were still a part of, or still connected to your mother, and therefore we are referring to this as the umbilical region. And then finally, we have the right and left iliac regions. These are the right and left lower corners of the abdominal pelvic cavity. And in the middle, we have the hypogastric. Hypo meaning below or less than gastric region. So that's the lowest gastric region that we can find in the body. And again, just as the quadrants, you should know the organs found in each respective abdominal pelvic region.